Hello, Utah. Hello, Cedar City. Hello, Iron County. One of the biggest goals of my campaign is lowering the cost of housing for people living in my district. A lot of people know that the cost of housing is a huge political problem. It's out of control, but not a lot of people are talking about what policy solutions exist to solve this problem. And I'm here to tell you that there are many. The most commonly proposed solution, and the one that our legislature is all gung ho on, is to increase the supply, to build more housing. And to do this, they're giving all sorts of tax credits to private developers to build more housing, to build middle housing, affordable housing. But as we've seen, generally that hasn't led to lower housing costs. In fact, it really only acts as a subsidy to pad the profits of these private developers. The truth is, the legislature knows that this is not the solution that is going to lower housing costs for regular working people, but so many of them are so deeply invested in the real estate and development industry that, of course, their solution is going to be, hey, let's increase this, let's build more housing, let's give tax dollars away to developers to build. And after 10 years of this explosive growth in Cedar City, and Utah in general, we just have not seen housing costs come down. In fact, we've seen them quintuple in the last 6 years. I take a different approach when it comes to policy solutions for the problems affecting our communities that I think every legislator, every politician in America should use, which is looking around the country and seeing what has been successful in other places and asking yourself if that can be emulated or copied here in your own community. So I'm a big proponent of social housing, co-housing, and cooperative housing. And I'll start with the biggest and scariest of the three of these, and that would be social housing. Social housing are publicly funded, publicly owned, permanently affordable housing projects. This means that the county is using tax revenue that would otherwise go to subsidize these private developments, and they're using it to actually build city-owned or county-owned housing developments. The main point of these housing developments is providing affordable housing for people that can't afford market rate housing and not trying to extract every cent of profit that you can out of the renters living there. So instead, rent would be actually tied to a percentage of the renter's income, something reasonable like 30% or less. So no matter how much money you make, you can at least afford an apartment in your own city. One thing that I want to say about social housing is that because it doesn't have the same profit incentive built into it, that it can have a longer payback timeline. The city can get access to better financing, and it can be generally much higher quality and more beautiful and integrated housing than you see these private developers building. We've seen, these rows and rows, acres and miles of townhomes going up that are just frankly low quality and ugly. Since social housing is publicly owned, the community would have a lot of input on what gets built and where it gets built and how it gets built. And we could build things with the long-term sustainability and beauty of our communities in mind. So imagine mixed-use, beautiful open spaces with tons of walkability, brick facades, and lots of green space. The goal of this is not to create a permanent renting class, but rather to allow people to save for their future so they can buy a house someday, so that they can start a family someday, and they're not spending decades and decades paying as much as they possibly can to their landlord. Scrimping and scraping by so this multinational real estate corporation can give its CEO another $1 billion. The really cool thing about social housing is that it is not just a drain on tax revenue, it actually has a net positive return on investment for your taxes. First of all, the city is building an asset that it owns permanently, and the rents that it collects from that are a permanent revenue for the city. Although the point is not to maximize profit as much as possible, there would be likely some profit that can be used to fund new future social housing developments. The effects of lowering housing costs wouldn't be felt immediately, but when a significant portion of the overall housing stock in a community is permanently affordable, that causes prices everywhere to come down. Co-housing is another really cool housing solution that we could be building now. It's just really tricky to get the financing for it, and a really simple legislation could address that and make it a lot more accessible to people. But basically, it's a group of people that are pooling their resources together to build essentially what is a condominium. So they each have their own private residences, but they have a central shared areas like a pool or a gym or a laundromat. And that allows all these people to have their own space, but also benefit from an economy of scale, if you will, when it comes to certain luxuries and amenities. Generally, co-housing communities are formed by groups of people with shared values and a shared expectation so that they are all responsible for upkeeping common areas while they're in charge of their own private residence. And finally, cooperative housing is very similar. This is a form of home ownership where residents buy shares essentially in a corporation that owns real estate rather than purchasing their specific unit directly. Shareholders then receive a lease that gives them exclusive right to occupy a unit and to participate in a democratic, nonprofit management of the overall property. So the difference from co-housing is that residents own shares in a nonprofit corporation that owns the property and the common areas and the land, whereas in co-housing, residents own their own private unit but have shared ownership over common spaces. The one that I think is going to work best and that I'd like to see implemented here in District 71 in Cedar City is social housing, where the cost of developing properties would fall on the city and they would be using tax revenue to do so, and then that would be publicly owned by the city. And it would be nonprofit or very low profit housing, with all the revenue generated through rents either used to upkeep the property or to invest in new future social housing projects. The truth is that most of us probably don't want to live in social housing or cooperative housing or co-housing projects. When we think of the American dream, we think about owning our own home with our family, that white picket fence, and none of these policies are forcing anybody into any of these projects. They're giving them another option. My ultimate focus is affordability of housing out here. And when someone has a choice between spending $1,500 a month renting a one bedroom from some greedy landlord or spending 30% of their income renting a social housing unit from the city, knowing that that money is going to fund more social housing projects that ultimately lower housing costs for everybody, I think a lot of people are going to choose the cheaper housing that has a bigger vision and a bigger goal. At the end of the day, all of these housing solutions have the ultimate effect of lowering housing costs for everybody in the community, whether you're a traditional home buyer or you're a renter or something else. And that is what makes communities healthy. When people can actually afford to live where they work and actually save for the future that they want to build for themselves, that is how we change the tide of history. Because as it is going right now, Gen Z, most of them will never own homes. Every generation is having less kids because they can't afford it. The truth is that the majority of our representatives make over $150,000 a year and they don't care what working people go through. They can't relate to our struggles because they don't share them. I do own a home, I'm paying a mortgage, but it is by far my largest monthly expense, and I have 4 roommates that are helping me subsidize that mortgage. And for a lot of people my age, and I'm almost 30 years old, that is the only way that we're ever going to be able to afford to get in. Utah is part of a trend that exists everywhere else in the country where the majority of new homes that are being built are owned by a corporation that is renting them to people. When people own their homes, they become invested in their communities, and that doesn't matter if that is social housing or a traditional mortgage. Working people all over this country are constantly facing higher costs and rising costs and inflation. And it's becoming impossible to live for regular working people. And the worst part is that this trend is not going to slow down or stop or reverse. It is just going to get worse. That is the future that the ruling class has planned for us. We have to stop them because the politicians in our legislature who pretend to represent us aren't doing anything to help us. Let me know what you guys think. Is this too close to communism, or is this a really smart, practical policy solution to solving the housing crisis here in Utah?